So I was recently engaged in a conversation with an individual through social media. And this particular conversation was taking place on the social media account of a regional uh, elected servant, an elected official, if you will. And this person was advocating that the governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, having mandated facial coverings, mandated face masks for the entire state anytime you're in a public building or outside of your own home, but inside something else, somewhere else, or in public outside where you can't social distance, everybody should be wearing masks. And so this person's advocacy was that we should all be taking responsibility for one another. Now, I realized that what this person was saying was, well, we should be taking responsibility for each other's health. But that's really not what they said. They said, basically, thank you, Governor, for making us all take responsibility for one another. Now, on its face, it sounds like, well, what's the big deal there, Todd? Why is that an issue? And the issue with that is that's actually an example of the Marxist influence on people's reasoning skills and on their intellect, such as it may be these days. The Marxist movement within the United States, especially within the realm of government school education, public universities, and even private universities and colleges these days, is just profound. And the idea of taking responsibility for others is very much, and this is going to sound countercultural for a Christian to say, but the idea of taking responsibility for others is very much a Marxist mentality. And here's why. If you look at the scriptures that I as a Christian hold to, and which are the source of truth in the world today, and I'm not going to get into an apologetic argument here, but as a Christian, the Christian scriptures, are the source of truth in the world. And the Christian scriptures never point us to take responsibility for others. They point us to taking responsibility for ourselves. And maybe I'm mincing a little bit here, or maybe I'm being pedantic. I'm okay with that, but we have to be able to read and listen and hear and dissect what's being said in people's comments, however those comments are being communicated. And what we need to understand in that is that nothing is said in a vacuum these days. I don't know that anything was ever said in a vacuum, completely devoid of any thought behind it at all. So, one of the teachings of Scripture is that the sins of the Father ultimately are not the sins of the Son. And now, the sins of the Father can be, to some degree, the penalties for those sins can be visited on the Son, but that's not saying that the Son is being held responsible for what the Father has done. That's saying that there are consequences to sin, and that sin goes on and on and on for generations. And just like blessing can. Abraham was blessed by God, and the blessing upon Abraham fell on multiple generations of the Hebrew people. Within Christianity, we see that the blessings of Christ fall into multiple, obviously, generations of Christians. Now, Christians don't have generations the same way that families and nations do. But so there is a reality in which the curse or the consequences or the blessings or the gifts can last for a long time. But the scriptures don't teach that you hold someone accountable for someone else, except in one case, and that's in Christ. Christ is held accountable for other people's sin. And that's a gospel message. But that's not what this person was saying. What Marxism teaches, and it's permeated the thought process of a vast majority of people in the United States today. What Marxism teaches is a form of generational attribution and societal attribution. So especially social Marxism. Now, economic Marxism has kind of the same idea behind it, and what we see at play in the United States today is a socio-economic Marxism with a heavy focus on the socio side. So economic Marxism says that you are responsible for the economic welfare of everyone around you. And there must be equity in the economy for people to be experiencing justice. So the harder you work, the more of what you financially gain must be distributed to others. That's being responsible for other people. Social Marxism says that we are responsible for other people and that we are to bear their burdens even if we're not responsible for where they find themselves. So socially, within social Marxism, within Gramscian Marxism, Gramscian theory, if your neighbor is suffering, it's your job to go and alleviate your neighbor's suffering by joining in his suffering. And I know there are people out there right now going, yeah, but that sounds like Christianity. No, and here's why. Christianity doesn't advocate for socialism or Marxism or communism, whatever name you want to put on it. Christianity advocates for Christians bearing each other's burdens and coming along and lifting people up so that they're in a position where they can do for themselves. What social Marxism says, bearing responsibility for one another, is you join them. Instead of everyone being lifted up to the same level, everybody's kind of brought down in equanimity, in equity, to the same place. So those who have the most, you take from them to bring them down, and down to the level of other people, so that their income or their societal standing is made level down here. That is societal attribution. It's societal manipulation. And so there's a, to some degree, the logical fallacy or the logical argument of reductio ad absurdum, which says let's take this to its most logical conclusion if we really live this out. And so I want to say, in fairness to this person, here's a reductio ad absurdum to the idea that we are to bear responsibility or share responsibility for others. Okay, if I need to social distance, I need to stay at home when I don't need to be out doing things, to bear responsibility for everyone else. If I need to cover my face to bear responsibility for everyone else, then also for you need to take the penalty of whatever crime your neighbor commits, so that your neighbor is not spending an unjust amount of time paying fines or going to jail. Right? I mean, that would be the logical conclusion of bearing responsibility for one another. I am not, as an individual, I am not responsible for other people's health. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't take steps to protect my neighbor in times of a health crisis or epidemic or pandemic. I should absolutely take those steps. And the argument's been made from Christianity that, well, quarantines are biblical. And there again, remember that this channel is not strictly a constitutional channel. It's a constitutional and Christian channel. And so now I don't mention the scriptures, and I don't mention Christian principles in every video. They are the underlying flow of why I argue for things like the Constitution the way that I do. And as I've said before in other videos, everybody has a subcurrent, everybody has a presupposition by which they approach every single event that's taking place around them. It's unavoidable. And I need coffee. You cannot dismiss your worldview, you cannot dismiss your presuppositions from how you approach what's happening in society. So, there are Christians who argue quarantines are biblical. It's your way of showing that you love your neighbor. Well, let's talk about biblical quarantines. First of all, you don't see them in New Testament teaching at all. You see them talked about by way of leper colonies in the New Testament, where, strangely enough, lepers are handled like normal citizens by Jesus. Jesus approaches lepers wherever they are. You know, he doesn't relegate them and go, oh, by the way, I'll go over here, and everybody, you go over here, so you don't spread leprosy whether you have it or not. Jesus actually just heals lepers wherever they might be. They're unclean in Jewish society, and Jesus heals them. But in the Old Testament, leprosy was a horrible curse, a horrible illness, and Jesus, or God, excuse me, Jesus is God, but in the Old Testament, God says to quarantine the ill. The ill. Quarantine those that are ill, demonstrably ill. And then after a period of quarantine, they are to be examined, and then they're allowed back into society if they're no longer ill. That's biblical quarantine. So for the Christians that are arguing that we should be isolating to protect our neighbors, then you should be isolating, quarantining yourself if you're sick. And I agree with that, because that's watching out for your neighbor, but that's not taking responsibility for your neighbor. Because where do we draw the line as Christians? Where do we draw the line as Americans? How far does my responsibility extend to my neighbor? And as I've said in a previous video, does my responsibility to my neighbor mean that I carry a gun to protect my neighbor? Do I not drink alcohol to protect my neighbor? Do I insist that my neighbor not smoke weed? Or do I insist to protect me? Or not smoke at all? And does my neighbor have a responsibility, even in their own home, to, or in public in any way, not smoke even outside around me? Or whatever the case might be. There's a line where here we have freedom, which comes with great responsibility, but also I'm not responsible for my neighbor in that sense, or for other people in society. Now, I'm to love my neighbor biblically, but love of neighbor doesn't look the way it's often advocated in modern Christianity, and it certainly isn't what the Marxist mentality today is of what it means to care for or take responsibility for your neighbor. Sadly, I actually think that many people today would say that it's my responsibility to intervene when my neighbor is accused of a crime and take the penalty for my neighbor's crime. We're seeing that a lot now with the shaming of white people for being white. What's really happening there is you're being told you need to take responsibility for the actions of other people that you have no affiliation with at all. So there's this, they're meshing, so the idea of whites taking responsibility for the actions of whites in the past is meshing with the idea that no, I'm supposed to self-isolate, I'm supposed to wear a face covering. All of these things are kind of coalescing into this Marxist spearhead, and it's, or should we say, a hypodermic needle of Marxism. It's being injected into the body politic of the United States, and they're trying to inject into that system, into the immune system and the respiratory system of the nation, the ideology and the mentality of Marxism that says that everybody has to bear the burden and the weight of everyone around them in every situation for the good of society. And that's just not how things work. I cannot be held accountable for other people's crimes. I cannot be held accountable for the victimization that's been done to other people. I cannot be held accountable for the health of other people. You have to be responsible for your own health. You have to take responsibility for your own health. Because the only way for society as a whole to take responsibility for all of society is for the government to step in and say, this is what it means for us to be taking responsibility for one another. That's a very, very, very scary thought. And I know I emphasize very, very many times. But that's a very scary thought. Because who gets to determine what responsibility looks like within the elected officials of this country? Because it may look very different from one person to the next. And right now, what's ruling the day, especially in states like Minnesota, in cities like Rochester and Minneapolis and St. Paul and others, is a Marxist mentality of, we will determine what's best for you and you will comply. You will do as we tell you to do, because we know what's best for you. You couldn't possibly understand and know how to handle yourselves. So if my interlocutor in the past conversation that I referenced at the beginning of this video really wants to be consistent, they should be insisting that everybody be held accountable for the financial well-being of other people, the physical well-being of other people, the mental health well-being of other people, for the criminal conduct of other people. And there again, I'm going to point at this, right now, we're being told that there are certain segments of society that shouldn't be charged with crimes because they live in poverty, and if we would do something to fix their poverty, then they wouldn't be committing crimes. See that? Take responsibility for one another. If you would do your part, people wouldn't be poor. If you would do your part, people wouldn't get sick. If you would do your part, people wouldn't commit crime. If you would do your part, people wouldn't die. That's not true. These things are, whether people recognize it or not, they're a virus, if you will. And it's being pushed into society by this viral Marxist injection, where your way of speaking, your way of thinking is being completely switched. I can't be held responsible for other people. And I can't be forced to take responsibility for other people's health, because ultimately you need to protect you. You need to protect you. You have to take care of you. If you don't take care of you, you can't expect that I can do anything to take care of you. And we see that over and over again in the social Marxism of the welfare state. This answer is we throw more money at it, throw more money at it, throw more money at it. And what happens? Those people are worse off by the time this is over. You can count on one hand, out of every 100 cases of social welfare recipients, 1 out of every 100, so 1% of people actually rise up out of social welfare and eventually, because of that, become something. Now, is it worth it for that person? Yes. But overall, once society takes responsibility for these folks, they never learn, and they stay dependent on society. And let's just be honest, it's not government welfare, it's societal welfare. Government doesn't generate that wealth. Work generates that wealth. Your meritocracy which is a positive thing, where you go out and you get a job and you work and you earn your money, and you are maybe rewarded with benefits and bonuses and things like that. You're earning that, and that's being stripped from you to reward somebody who isn't doing that. That isn't government giving them that money. That's government taking money by force, under the threat of law, under the threat of force, taking it from you and giving it to them. And that's what it looks like when we're forced to take responsibility for one another. That is dangerous, because it's never enough. And sure, rich people can be greedy too. Sure, capitalists are greedy, but they're no more greedy than the Marxists are. In fact, I would say to some degree, they're less greedy. Marxists are greedy because they contribute nothing and they take from those who do. And that is not biblical, and nor is it constitutional, nor is it American. It's a decidedly anti-American way of thinking, and it's a decidedly anti-Christian way of thought. So, that being said, think about the terminology that you use, and if you're one who advocates for this idea that we need to be taking responsibility for one another, think about what it means when you say that and what it looks like from a biblical perspective. As always, thanks for watching the video. Thanks for being open-minded. Thanks for listening. I would ask that over here in the corner, somewhere on your screen, you hit the subscribe button. It's important, not for me, but because mainstream media, legacy media, isn't going to get the word out. They're not going to let people who don't toe the established line speak. So for the sake of liberty and for the sake of the defense of this nation, small little independent voices like mine need to be heard, especially the interviews. It's got very little to do with my commentary and a lot more to do with the interviews and the people who are affected when liberties are tread on. So once again, hit the subscribe button, like, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much.